Now that the lights are getting close to what we want them to be, we're starting to really see that the shininess of our textures is not appropriate for gold. And if we come back around to our material settings, the top two settings that we have represent the tarnished metal, which you can actually see right here as we click on these two layers. So we know that we're dealing with the top and the bottom of our chalice. I also remember that we changed the diffuse color of our base. So I know that right now, selecting layer 2 here, we're talking about the texture of our base. So with that selected, I want you to come over to our material settings, and under shininess, I want you to change the shininess value. And remember, shininess represents the size of the specular highlights, which by default looks very much like plastic. They're tiny little highlights. And I want to change that value down to 30%. That's going to make our object less shiny and create a much larger specular highlight. And the end result looks much more like metal, doesn't it? Looks a lot more like gold. So we'll come back up to the top. Once again, shininess, set that down to 30%. And now the top looks a lot more metallic as well, although it's not as completely clear with the current lighting settings. So let's take our red light and once again use our light tools to change the position of our red light so you can get a little more of an idea of what we're talking about here. Good. Now, you also may notice some sharp edges are starting to show up here and there. Don't worry about that, but just so as you know what it is, that sharp edge is a result of the shadows that's being cast by our two backlights. The orange light coming from this direction, the brightness of it comes around to here, at which point it falls into shadow and creates that hard line. The same thing happens over on the left side of our screen with our yellow light, which creates this hard line as well. Later on, once we've given ourselves higher quality settings and added a bump map, that's going to go away. So just don't worry too much about it at this point. And now that we've confirmed the gold looks as gold as we want it to look, especially down here at the base, which is just beautiful, let's play a little bit more with the intensity. Take that down maybe to 1.25 on each of these layers. And once again, we can adjust those as needed a little bit later. But I like that better. That's a little bit more subtle. Now I want to add a point light to our scene. I want the inside of our goblet to be glowing. We can't even see the inside of our goblet at this point, so let's come over to our camera tools, and let's choose the orbit tool. And if we click and push up, our view should orbit up and over, and we can see down into our goblet. You can also see the crisscrosses of the shadows that are generated by our various lights. We'll address those in just a moment. For now, set the view to something around here. Then come down to the bottom of our 3D panel, and where you see the little new document icon, click on that and choose New Point Light. And you'll see that up here in the point lights category, we've generated a nice, bright, white point light. We can tell it's white by looking down here. If we change that to red, let's just make it full-on intense red. That's pretty nice, pretty intense, and it makes the inside of our cup glow very nicely. However, as we mentioned a moment ago, we've got these shadows to contend with. And the shadows are actually the result of the fact that our orange lights and our front red light, but that's less important from this point of view because we're not really seeing the red light shadow, which is cut off by the front of the cup. We are, however, seeing a shadow that's being cast from this infinity orange light over on the right. That's the shadow line that we see here, and a similar one that's being cast by the yellow light that is positioned over on this side, generating this light here. So let's come over to those lights, and instead of using infinite lights, we like the angle the lights are coming from, but because these lines are parallel, that's what's creating these shadows. That's infinite light is actually, there's parallel versions of those lines that are peeking up over the edge of the cup. That's not what we want. We want to actually keep the inside of the cup only illuminated by the red point light that we just added. So come over to our two back infinite lights and change them from infinite to spot. And as we do, you'll see that they recategorize themselves in our list from infinite to spot. And this one will do exactly the same thing. When we switch it from an infinite to a spot, it's now listed up here. Now, that's done a beautiful job of allowing the inside of the cup to only be illuminated by the red light that we added, but it's also changed the overall quality of the light in our scene rather dramatically. Also, things on screen are a little bit harder to see. There is a little yellow wireframe over here on this side and an orange wireframe over on this side, but they're against this really light checkered background, so they're kind of difficult to see. Let's see if changing our preferences under transparency and gamut to a dark grid will allow us to see those more clearly. And sure enough, it does. We have a better view now of the cone of light that we're producing from our spotlights. And to adjust that cone, we want to basically widen up the amount of light. We want to open up our spotlight beam so that it covers more of our model and ends up looking more like our infinite lights did before. And we do that with these controls that we see down here. The hotspot represents the center part of the spotlight. As you hover over it, you can see this little graphic of a spotlight lights up. So it shows us that we're adjusting the hotspot, and here the fall off. And I'm going to crank this fall off amount up to about 75 degrees. When I do, you'll see the cone that represents the spread of light from our spotlight gets much, much bigger. And the hot spot as well, we can widen up to, let's say, about 40 degrees. And that brings in a lot more light on our base and creates a nicer effect. We'll do the same thing to our orange light. Set that to about 40. And our fall off was set to about 75 degrees, just as before. And the end result should look something like what you see on screen here. Some nice strong shadows at the base and a definite glow coming from inside our cup. And we can readjust our view a little bit so we're back towards a more front view. Now the effect I'm going for here is that the lights that are illuminating our skull should feel as if they're being produced by fire. And right now, the sharp edges of these shadows that we're seeing, both on the top part of our chalice and the base of our chalice, look much more like artificial light than they do a natural flame, which also is kind of large. When a light source is large, it doesn't create sharp shadows, it creates softer shadows. We can adjust that over here by adjusting the softness value, which by default is 0%, and that's why our shadows are kind of harsh. If we change this to a different value, and it doesn't have to be much, let's start with a value about 5%. Even that might be a little too high. Yeah, that's pretty much wiped out all hint of shadows. It's definitely softer, but maybe a little bit too soft. Let's try 2%. And now we get a hint of the shadow, but the harder edge is gone. In fact, I'm even going to take it a little further down and say 1%. There we go. We can still sort of see where the shadows are intended to be, but the sharp edge has been smoothed out. Let's do the same thing to our other spotlight. Just set it to a 1% softness, and that takes some of our harsh edge away from our scene. We should probably do that with the red light as well. There we go. And now with those changes made, we can come down and turn off the switch that allows us to see the lights interactively in the scene. Don't need to view those anymore, at least for now. And now let's move on and focus on texturing the other major element of our scene, which is this center element, the skull and crossbones.